Anyways, I am starting with a question about, short interview question. Your company utilizes the ELK Stack for logging. The ELK Stack we covered briefly in the live lecture. You discover performance bottlenecks at the collection and preliminary processing stage. What components should you investigate? If you determine that component is no longer meeting your needs, what could you replace or augment it with? Breaking down this question and using the bits and pieces of it to your advantage, that's going to be really important here, because specifically asking performance bottlenecks at the collection and preliminary processing stage. To elaborate on that a little bit, the logging in a distributed logging process, collecting logs more or less happens at the host level at the leaf nodes. Those logs then can have some preliminary processing in order to be compatible with the ultimate destination, the centralized storage. For the ELK stack, that would be Elasticsearch, obviously. A quick note on the realism of such a question. I doubt that you would be asked specifically about the ELK stack, but of course, with these questions, we are being a little bit more specific. More likely, unless the interviewer specifically expects that you should know the company's distributed logging system, or else you have said on your resume or otherwise volunteered that you understand the ELK stack. They likely won't specifically ask you about it, but we'll ask about it in this question. Which component should you investigate is the next piece. So the ELK stack, if you remember, Elasticsearch, I already said that's the storage solution. Logstash is the L. And so that is what aggregates the logs and collects them. So that is the component that we're talking about here. And K is Kibana, and that's the more for visualizing and doing some analysis from the storage solution, Elasticsearch. So that's the full stack there. It might be easier if I just go ahead and pull up a whiteboard to illustrate this somewhat. So I will go ahead and set that up real quick. So I've got a blackboard, and the reason why I want to have this visual for this is just because, again, you might leave the class, you might leave the program, and you might totally forget what the ELK stack stands for. But if you think of logging, I want you to remember just kind of some of these components that exist in a distributed system. So let's go ahead and get a little brush here and just create that E in the middle, or more or less in the middle. The K over here, Kibana, and I'll put the L over here. That doesn't spell ELK, but that's just the way it is. So the reason why we're splitting it up, E is the central storage solution. I'm going to make this brush even smaller. And then K visualizes that by calling into it. And then L is kind of where we have all those nodes and everything. So each of these circles roughly representing a host or maybe a cluster, and those will all deliver their logs to Elasticsearch. Now we've established now that according to the constraints of the question, there's a performance issue, and it's happening at the collection stage, which is here, collection and pre-processing stage. Logstash is cool and fancy, and it has a lot of flexibility. And that's great, because what if you didn't want to use Elasticsearch? What if you wanted to do something else instead, like maybe roll out your own Hadoop clusters or just anything else, really? So maybe Logstash is fancy enough to have some plugins that allow it to transform that data and give it to whatever solution you decide on. So, but that comes at a cost. And that cost is that Logstash can get a little bit bulkier as a service running, especially if you have thousands and thousands of machines. And just reviewing the last part of the question, that we have here, if you determine that the component is no longer meeting your needs, what could you replace or augment it with? And this is a call out to another thing briefly discussed in the lecture. Elastico also came out with this thing called Beats, which just kind of goes one level further with being a little more lightweight. And you can have beats, certain types of beats, send logs and events to Logstash, which can aggregate them at sort of mid-level and then send forward those to Elasticsearch. So I'm going to add another column here, and I'm going to make it B. And now we have Blech, but it doesn't mean anything. So ELK Stack is obviously a lot more preferred. So yeah, in this case, you could potentially save a lot of resources by simply switching to Geico. No, by using a more lightweight collection that runs on each of your potentially thousands of hosts, or tens of thousands, depending on how far it goes. But this isn't really the end of the answer, though. Maybe you want to lessen your dependence on Elastico because they are obviously a for-profit company, and even though their products are open source and everything, they do want to push you into paying for their services. And maybe you decide that, hey, well, you know what, we're going to host these ourselves, and we want them to meet our needs and not be tied to you as a vendor. So some other things that are out there at the B and at the L segment include FluentD, FluentD and FluentBit, and I'm going to put the Fs down here, FluentD and FluentBit. Again, might be a little bit hard to remember those. That's okay. I haven't been asked, again, specifically in an interview, what's the difference between FluentD and FluentBit? Well, that's trivia. But more importantly, FluentD is similar to Logstash. It has flexibility. It has a lot of plugins. It's written in C and Ruby, so that means that once again we're seeing with all this robustness an impact on your resources and a burden there that multiplied across hundreds of thousands of hosts will really start to add up. And so FluentBit, similarly to Beats, FluentBit is more lightweight. It's written in C. It doesn't have dependencies. There are fewer plugins. So that means less flexibility, but that might be okay because maybe you just want to use FluentBit to feed FluentD anyways, and then FluentD being more flexible could send those logs to Elasticsearch or to whatever centralized solution you want. So that is, that's essentially what that would look like. So we've established that this would be the component we might want to look at for performance issues. If we don't like how it's behaving, if we want to replace it or augment it, we add Beats, or else maybe we add FluentBit. Maybe we use FluentD instead. I'm pretty sure that FluentBit can talk to Logstash. And it's also quite possible that Beats could talk to FluentD. If you were in an interview and probably pressed to be like, well, if you're the senior engineer making this decision, what would you do? Would you do Beats to FluentD to Elasticsearch? You definitely would want to consider that, again, Elastico wants you to, you're being tied to a vendor if you continue to use Elastico, which may or may not be worth it. They make it easy, and maybe that is worth your while. Switching things up, like using FluentBit and FluentD together, will probably fit together nicely. So it might come down to what features does it have versus what features do you need, and is it worth migrating? Whereas combining them, mixing them up like FluentBit to Logstash, well, again, hopefully they'll be compatible enough for your needs, and maybe that's just a baby step into migrating away from being tied to a vendor. So that is pretty much it for that question. I see there's no questions in the Q&A or hands raised, so I'll go ahead and continue to another question from the short answer subjective interview questions. Again, feel free. Oh, I see a hand raised.
Want to become a software engineer at Google? You can, like thousands of our students. You just need to learn from those who've already cleared FANG interviews. At Interview Kickstart, our interview prep courses are developed and taught live by 150 plus instructors from Tier 1 companies like Google and Facebook. Our courses are tailored to help you crack software engineering domain interviews, including back-end, full stack, machine learning, embedded systems, data science, and more. To learn more, book your free webinar slot today